Welcome, Greek U Nation, to episode number 216 of the Fraternity Foodie Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Ilon, CEO of Greek University. I'm a speaker, and now we are a two-time author team. Our second book, From Letters to Leaders, Redefining New Member Education and Leveraging Belonging to Eliminate Hazing, is available now on Amazon. Go pick it up. Tish has got the book right there for you. We call these episodes the Fraternity Foodie Podcast because there's nothing like great food to bring fraternity and sorority leaders together. Fun fact, our next guest was speaking at SGLA, which is the Southeastern Greek Leadership Association annual conference in Atlanta last weekend. I walked into the room and the place was packed with students from every fraternity, every sorority council, you name it. I literally gave up my seat to a student because it was standing room only. And Tish had the whole crowd mesmerized with her program. It was called Staying Power, an intersectional analysis of the role of archival imagery in the Black fraternal movement. And this is a prolific visual representation featuring photographs drawn from various archival collections that she uses as a tool to educate and empower fraternity and sorority life communities to think critically about their values and their chapter's role in promoting DE&I initiatives. The crowd absolutely loved it, and she is going to have a very busy spring semester speaking all over the country with that program. So let me tell you a little bit about Tish. Tish Norman is a dynamic and energetic keynote speaker. She's a DE&I consultant, and she uses public speaking as a platform for change. She's frequently referred to as Coach T, and Tish is the founder of Transforming Leaders Now Incorporated, a consultancy specializing in college and career readiness, women, DE&I topics, and the African American experience. Tish has written several published articles, 5 books, and a forthcoming scheduled release this December. Tish is a graduate of Kentucky State University, where she was inducted into Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. She has a Master of Arts in Education from Pepperdine University, and among a multitude of campus presentations, she has presented her doctoral research at the Dr. Joseph H. McMillan National Conference on the Black Family in America and National Council for Black Studies. So I have to say, welcome to the show, Tish Norman. I am so pumped for this conversation.
Listen, me too. And I have to say a very special, listen, audience, if this is your first time or your 1000th time attending and listening and tuning into this podcast, is Mike Ilon not the sugar honey iced tea? I tell you what, he's the hardest working man in Greekdom right now. And it is honestly my honor and privilege to be a guest on his Fraternity Foodie Podcast, mixing food and FSL together. So it is certainly my privilege and honor to be here specifically to talk about a really important topic. So Mike, I'm so glad to be here.
Absolutely. And I love your background. I have to say that HBCU background is just doing it for me today. I love it.
Ow.
So let's talk about it. I mean, these first colleges for Black students were established largely through Black churches and the support of the American Missionary Association and the Freedmen's Bureau. So talk to us a little bit about how these historically Black colleges and universities started in the United States.
Absolutely. And so when we think about higher ed in America, because you have to be able to lay a historical context when discussing HBCUs, and then even if we get into it, if we have time, the genesis of Black Greek letter organizations, that fraternal movement, right? You have to take yourself back to what the original intent of higher ed in America was, what the intention was, and then who it was intended for. And so we're literally looking at higher ed in America being designed and patterned after European colleges, the Oxfords, and the schools like that with those very pristine and almost castle-like edifices on their campus, right? And so you see these early institutions like Harvard and Princeton that were literally patterned, the College of William and Mary, they were literally patterned after these campuses taking the lead from these European schools. They were designed for white male clergy, to prepare white men to be able to be involved within, a religious community. And so it was very rote learning, right? And it was not much socializing going on. It was very strict. And so when we think about how that was what we know as higher ed today, many, many years ago, it was not designed for and with Black people in mind, okay? And so with that being said, during a time in this country, during slavery, post-slavery even, after 1865, once again, these very segregated policies were in place. Not only were Black people there were laws against Black people being educated, but these institutions simply were not open to them. John Chavis actually was the first Black man in 1799 to obtain a bachelor's degree on record at what we know now as Princeton University. Well, he was the anomaly because once again, on a large scale, Black people, specifically both genders, male and female, were not being educated during that time. And so you had, you're right, Mike, you had a lot of Northern philanthropists, because think about post-Civil War. Think about post-Civil War. Who had the land? Who had the resources? Who had accumulated wealth? Who had the money? And so once slavery had ended, there were many ecumenical organizations like the American Missionary Association, the Freedmen's Bureau, even single individuals, maybe some that had accumulated wealth and were affiliated with missionary societies. They donated land, they donated money, they underwrote the building of these communities, these campus communities, and to pay homage for these donations, be it land, be it money, resources, etc. A lot of these institutions named their school after these people. And so just to give you kind of the short version of it, Black people weren't allowed to be educated, all right? Black people were not allowed to be taught to read. You can go to jail for teaching a Black person how to read, because education and awareness meant progress, and people did not like that, okay? And so once there were these Northern philanthropists where the racial climate was stark difference from the North to the South, when they would come to the South and donate and be able to create opportunities to partner oftentimes with Black churches in the South, with already institutions that were doing the work, but they just did not have the safe space to do it, the capacity to do it. Maybe it was in the basement of a church. Maybe it was in someone's home. A lot of HBCUs in the South were started in those conditions. And so when you had the will and then you had the resource put together, that's when we see the genesis of HBCUs. Got it.
So let's talk about content, curriculum. I mean, you can look at the notable figures at HBCUs. I mean, the list goes on and on. W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, Booker T. Washington, MLK Jr. What is the focus of an HBCU early on in terms of content and curriculum?
So once again, what was the station for the most part, not comprehensively, but for the most part, the station of Black people in America at that time was in our agricultural space, all right? And so what we have to think about now is the typical college student, right, Mike? You're 18. You graduate in June, you go to college in August, you're 18. Well, back in the day when these HBCUs were starting, there weren't the types of, elementary school, middle school, high school, college. And so what we saw was the birth of normal schools. These were the names because many HBCUs went through nomenclature changes many of them starting out as normal schools, where on any campus you would see 5th grade all the way up through grade 16, if you will. And so they had farming environments. Yes, you may have done some things in the classroom, but it was very minimal dedication turned to studying philosophy and science and Latin and English. Most of what you saw comprehensively across the HBCU curriculum was in a domesticated or agricultural space. Mm-hmm. Tuskegee Institute, for example, you mentioned Booker T. Well, mm-hmm. Booker T, of course, attended Hampton, walked over 300 miles to end up studying under General Armstrong, who actually created what we know now as Hampton Institute or Hampton University. And then once he was apprenticed by General Armstrong, as well as receiving money from other Northern philanthropists, he was commissioned to go ahead and start Tuskegee for the purpose of educating Black people in a domestic and or agricultural space. Tuskegee became this powerhouse because it became the prototype. It became the epicenter. It became the flagship institution for other HBCUs to pattern their curriculum after, because there was an element of dignity that Booker T included into Black people being able to be self-sustaining. Mm-hmm. You can do it. You can do it just in this manner. And it was through the domestic space. It was through the agricultural space. So if you're going to be that domestic and work in a home or a hotel, if you're going to be a farmer, then be the best you can be and then provide for your family that way. That opinion wasn't so popular with a lot of Black leaders at that time, because also, as you mentioned, W.E.B. Du Bois, a graduate of Fisk Institute, he, on the other hand, was not born enslaved like Booker T was. He was born to free Black parents in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. So he did not grow up with that same sort of worldview and perspective and ideology that Booker T did. So he said, yes, we will study the greats. We will study philosophy. We will get the right to vote. So we know historically that the Du Bois and Washington debate on how the progress of Black people should be and what that should look like, and the mode, should it be assimilation and gradualism, or should it be absolutely not? We know we can do that. We've been domesticated. Let's find our way through an educational space that will make us a little bit more advanced and give us another way to provide for our family and progress the race and uplift the race, not just through the domestic and agricultural space. So yeah, we still have that debate now. I mean, it's the incessant conversation. Yeah.
I mean, the real issue seems like that there was just no good alternatives for Black students to study outside of HBCUs until the mid-20th century. And one of the criticisms early on for HBCUs was whether the separate schools actually hindered efforts towards social and economic equality with whites. Do you think that that's a fair criticism?
No, absolutely not. I don't know. I don't know if I want to say either or yes and. Mm-hmm. All right. Mm-hmm. Because once again, that was our only choice. Right. You did have institutions like Berea College in Kentucky, right? Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, Oberlin College outside of Cleveland, Ohio, and Oberlin, Ohio. You had some schools that had a liberal community that chose to admit Black students. But let's be clear, you did not attend all of the social things, and you were not engaged in what would have been student life at that time if you were admitted. All right. Mm-hmm. Very often, like for example, IU Bloomington during the late 1800s, early 1900s, like these other schools I just mentioned, they would admit Black students, but sometimes you couldn't even attend and sit in class. There are accounts where you had to sit in the hallway or even sit outside and listen into class because your professors didn't want you there, all right? They had to do what the school mandated. You could attend class, but you could not eat in the cafeteria. You can cook the food in the caf, but you couldn't eat in the caf. You could work and cook and clean in fraternity houses, but you could not join the fraternity. And so while you had these separate facilities, once again, that were around the age range of as young as 5th grade up through, 18, 20 or so, these were very necessary institutions because we were not admitted into the PWIs. And even if we were, the racial climate was so difficult and so tense that no one wanted to fight that fight. I mean, Jackie Robinson didn't want to be the first Jackie Robinson. From the things that we know that the firsts go through. Can you imagine what students went through in the mid 1800s or even late 1800s or early 1900s being the first? And that account, Mike, even went well into the 60s and 70s in this country. The 1960s and 1970s, PWIs were still being integrated by one Black student or multiple. And so the economic inequality and these kinds of efforts that were systematically designed to create a caste, a separate society, to elevate and promote one race and to keep the other one oppressed and separate and economically and politically disadvantaged. Absolutely, that's not fair. I think the key word here is equity. And so Black people were able to be taught by and for us, even if these institutions were founded and established or underwritten by white people. It was for the purpose of educating Black teachers and professors to educate the masses. And so those were the types of environments that we saw during that time. It's so much. It's so much. I mean, you and I are literally touching on but a snapshot of the depth and the breadth of the comprehensive story and history of HBCUs. So
that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that explanation, because it makes total sense. I mean, at the PWI, it certainly doesn't seem like the right student experience at all. So for Black students at that time, certainly not. So in the past 3 decades, we've had 5 HBCUs that have closed their doors. Many more are on academic probation. Maybe they've lost their accreditation. Do you think this is because HBCUs right now are at a crossroads, or is it just because all colleges and universities are feeling the pinch right now?
Yeah, no, I would definitely say, listen, I heard George Fraser say this many years ago, author, thought leader, economic strategist, Black economic strategist. He said, when America catches a cold, Black America catches pneumonia, okay? And so if there is a pinch, if there's an economic pinch that some PWIs are feeling out there, the HBCUs are on the struggle bus, okay? Once again, it has been the incessant battle of challenging and demanding the relevancy of HBCUs in this country. We shouldn't have ever needed HBCUs. We shouldn't have even needed them. But because we needed them and because they were severely underfunded, since the beginning, it has been the incessant battle. When you think of the largest endowments that the 2 or 3 HBCUs have, like a Howard, like a Spelman, when you think of their largest endowments, which could be, 400 million or 40, some 3-figure $1 million endowment, whatever it is, I don't have the exact numbers. They pale in comparison to the endowments that some major PWIs have, okay? And so when you think about the academic probation and you think about the differences in why people would choose to send or not send their child to an HBCU, it has to be a little bit more deep-seated than just the facilities and just the, athletics and the football teams, okay? Many times, the type of product that HBCUs produce is one that can go in and walk in a room with your head held high, with your shoulders back, with your chin up, and take your seat at the table rather than wait and be offered one, all right? And sometimes the Black student does not get that level of confidence and self-assuredness at PWIs. And so my parents both attended Central State, graduated from Central State University, as many of my family members did. And even in the 60s, when they were there were talks of merging Central State and subsequently across the street, Wilberforce University, under a subsidiary of either the University of Dayton or OSU. And so the same at my alma mater. Y'all see my school is right there, Kentucky State University. There's been talk even before I was there in the 90s, even into the 60s. And mind you, Mike, in the 60s, HBCUs were in their glory days, all right? From the 50s until about the 90s, that nice 50-year stretch, that half-century stretch, those literally were the glory days of HBCUs. But those who may not have been as reputable as what we would know as the top 10 or the Black Ivy League schools, they have been sorely affected by financial contributions. And I would say the byproducts of the low enrollment, of the academic probation and other challenges, athletic, has been because of the financial inequities. You just sometimes cannot make the comparison of how we see in this country now, some junior high schools, community colleges even, with amazing state-of-the-art facilities, because I've been in them, all right? Amazing state-of-the-art facilities, and then the neighboring HBCU, sometimes even in that same city, with less than subpar, less than standard facilities, but still in the midst of produce stellar products. So we continue to fight, many presidents you may have known in the news the other week, right there in your home city, Nashville, Tennessee State University just reclaimed from the state of Tennessee $250 million that was promised to that school well over 100 years ago. And because the inequities at that time, maybe brushed it under the carpet, these presidents now are fighting to reclaim those funds. And so I think with TSU receiving $250 million from the state that was naturally theirs anyway, right? It was as a land grant institution. They'll be able to do an effect and impact many more students in years to come. So, it's an uphill battle, sometimes uphill on roller skates, but the fight will continue. Yeah.
As you talk, I'm trying to figure out a solution. I'm trying to figure out how do we get out of this vicious cycle that you've described, because poorly prepared students lead to low graduation rates. Low graduation rates make state governments and other investors reluctant to inject the money that's needed in these schools. And then cash-strapped HBCUs now have inferior facilities and underpaid faculty. So how do we get the states to invest more into HBCUs over the flagship universities and PWIs that have all state-of-the-art stuff?
We continue to promote the value in preparing Black students as viable contributors to this society. We remind states of the stellar products that HBCUs have produced over the last 150 plus years. We continue to create opportunities for states where major corporations are housed to develop strategic partnerships to funnel HBCU students into their workplaces so they can begin to see the value and experience how their companies are better because of their diversity and inclusion and equity efforts. And so we think of some of the best of what Black America has to offer our entire country: CEOs, mayors, politicians, governors, presidents. There's no notable Black person in this country in the last 100 years that is not connected to an HBCU. If it is a political leader, if it is a thinker, if it is a business person, a director, a developer, there is some way, somehow, if they themselves were not the graduate, their parents were. Mm-hmm. If they or their parents weren't, the principal of their school was. Their next door neighbor who mentored them, whatever, their counselor at school. There's always going to be some sort of connection, because once again, that was all that was available for a certain amount of time, okay? And so I think we've also seen and experienced and felt the pinch, because once America's universities, the PWIs rather, began to desegregate, all right, and more Black students began attending HBCUs. I don't care if it is through the athletic channel or platform or what, you began to not be able to compete. If you, Mike, as a parent, has a child that gets a full ride to UT Knox, and your child is but offered maybe a $5,000 or $10,000 scholarship to attend Fisk, you're gonna go as a parent, we'll take a full ride for $900, Alex. Yes. You know, so we have not been able to compete economically and financially with the PWIs, who are recruiting the best of the best. So the best and the brightest Black students who are getting these full rides to the PWIs, their parents and them are making the decision, hey, we got to go where the money is. And so that tends to have a bearing on the stellar products that HBCUs were producing in those glory days when that's what we had. So we have to continue to remind states of that. We have to get our legislation, and we have to get our local, national, political leaders to advance the agenda of HBCUs and to recognize the value, not as an option, right? Not as the other, because we have been in this space of otherness for over a century, but to use it as an option, as a mainstream, not the second or third choice, but the first choice. So continue to create opportunities to put HBCUs in the limelight, Nike. Continue to put HBCUs in the limelight, LeBron, right? Where we have, you know, Deion Sanders. You saw this, Mike. Deion Sanders, coach at Jackson State University, the sonic boom of the South, right? Ex-Pro Bowler, coach of the Jackson State football team. Oh my God, he got the #1 recruit in the nation to go to Jackson State. He's not going to a Pac-10 school. He's not going. Yep, he sure did. Eddie George, he's coaching at Tennessee State. LeBron, Melo, they're sending their Shaq, Melo, they're sending their kids to HBCUs. What? We continue to create opportunities to turn more attention to and create exposure to HBCUs, so that attending, knowing what they produce, and then more importantly, understanding the financial need continues to be top of mind thinking and top of the agenda on the conversation.
This makes a lot more sense to me now. So thank you for explaining this to me and to the audience. You know, one of the stories that you brought my attention to over the last 2 weeks was that the FBI is now investigating recent bomb threats against at least 17 historically Black colleges and universities across the United States. And it seems that these threats underscore the need to teach new generations about the history of violence targeting people of color, so the lessons of the past can be applied to what we're seeing right now. How do we ultimately overcome these threats against HBCUs? And is it education? Is it investing in HBCUs? How do we overcome all of these threats?
I don't understand, because that happened, you know, a lot of conversation was around, oh, wow, that all happened on the first day of Black History Month. My institution, my alma mater, KSU, was one of those schools that they had to cancel class because of these collective bomb threats. Well, I say this, though it is problematic and troublesome, it is deeply rooted in the history of violence in and toward the Black community. Years ago, was it the early 2000s, this country saw a series of Black church bombings as if it were 1920. I'd never seen that. Just within the last 2 decades, there was a series of 8 to 12 church bombings, Black church bombings, as if we were still living in Jim Crow racist America. And so we think about why HBCUs were targeted with these bomb threats. I think it is, once again, a teachable moment. There is a time to introduce the history of violence toward Black institutions in this country that do target people of color. There's always a teachable moment in tragedy. And I think these threats should not go unnoticed. It is my hope that the FBI turns as much attention to these threats of violence toward institutions that produce people that can make a difference out there in the world. I hope we are still talking about this later. We're in this space now, Mike, of this racial reckoning since the last 2 years of the George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor murders. But what about all the people who were murdered before that? Like that happened to have been the trifecta of this kind of impetus, this start, or this reigniting or reigniting rather of DE&I trainings and the conversation being at the top of the agenda for organizations across the board. But we can't talk about that without talking about why these bomb threats happen. We can't talk about that without collectively coming up with ways to overcome these threats. We just keep going on. I think, you know, when you think about how HBCUs started back in the day, many of those institutions were burned by white people who were intimidated by the progress of Black people in that time. We think about Black Wall Street in Tulsa, where just doctors, dentists, schools, pharmacists, movie theaters, corner stores. It was the Harlem of Oklahoma. It was the Black Wall Street, they called it, because so many businesses were thriving and Black communities were established and families were safe, and people who were at the top of the rung lived right there among their community. But at the threat of progress, white Oklahomans, white Tulsa natives, communities burned that community down to the ground. And so we have to be able to talk about the very shameful past of America. You cannot understand how you move forward without dealing with the past. And we even think about the legislation that's being passed in this country now about what teachers can teach. It's not just Black history, it is American history. You cannot omit and extract history that took place in this country, no matter how shameful it was. You have to be able to embrace that and understand it so that we can be better for it moving forward. And that's why we're still in the same position we're in many ways. My uncle is 74, Mike, and he said about 3 years ago, I cannot believe that you and I are having a conversation right now that I had as a student at Cleveland State University when I was 21. Mm. He said, that was over 55 years ago, 50 years ago. He said, how is it that we're not progressing? How is it that the same concerns that Carter G. Woodson and W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about in the miseducation of the Negro and the souls of Black folk, how are those still challenges even a century later? So are we making progress in some ways? Yes. But we also are taking steps back when on the first day of Black History Month, we find out that multiple HBCUs received bomb threats, which hindered the educational advancement of Black people in this country. So it's just a drop in the bucket of you and I having this conversation. I hope that whoever tends to view this later, they share it with some people and then they start to have the conversation.
Right. Well, I'm so glad to have this conversation because it's important. And I think based on this conversation, I already think that I know what the answer is. I'm going to ask this question anyway, which is what pushed the Black Greek letter fraternal movement to start in 1906 at Cornell University, Alpha Phi Alpha, and 1908 at Howard University for Alpha Kappa Alpha? What was the impetus for that?
So once again, back to the beginning where I mentioned how Cornell and Oberlin and Berea and Wellesley and different schools were admitting Black students. They were admitting Black male students for the most part, right? Mm-hmm. When Alpha Phi Alpha was established in 1906. Of course, that began in 04, 05, and then eventually became to be in 06. These Black students, so Ithaca is a port town, right? It's on water, all right? Mm-hmm. And also New York, that part of Ithaca is close to Canada. And so that was a space of a thriving Black community in Ithaca. Believe it or not, as white as Ithaca is, right? There was a thriving Black community because what happens in port towns? There's a lot of traffic, there's a lot of commerce, there's trade that goes on. So there's jobs, all right? Mm-hmm. And so there was a thriving Black community there, though small, that had even seen the likes of Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and other abolitionists during that time. The Black students who were attending Cornell, once again, were not living on campus, but were housing with families there in the Ithaca community. Well, how can we engage ourselves? We're young. We want to do some fun stuff. We're seeing these guys do it. We'd like to do the same. How can we collectively support one another, not just academically, but socially as well, and then engage and just let our hair down so that we can grow and develop as humans, socially, academically, spiritually, just comprehensively. And so coming together and taking the lead through what students were being engaged and socialized during that time was through literary societies, through debate teams and debate clubs. That's how these young men eventually became close to one another, getting support from older, more seasoned community members, and then of course beginning Alpha Phi Alpha. That was not the first Black fraternity that was ever founded. That was the first Black fraternity college-aged that was founded and that survived, all right? It was able to grow. So you've got your Alpha chapter in Ithaca at Cornell, right? You've got your Beta chapter. You've got the second chapter that was established then where? At what we know as the Mecca, Howard University in Washington, D.C. So we had a member, one of the 7 jewels of APHIA, then traversed to D.C. and began establishing an Alpha chapter there at Howard. Well, one of the first initiates on that Beta line had a high school sweetheart that he and her both attended high school together back in St. Louis. and they ended up there at Howard together as well. His name was Charles Lyell, all right? Well, Charles Lyell was dating Ethel Hedgeman, who subsequently, as I said, they were high school sweethearts. When you spend time with your college boo, you start talking and you're sharing out and you have ideation sessions. Well, Ethel Hedgeman then became what we know as the visionary founder and established Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated, which of course started the conversation around 1906. Now think about this, Mike. Ethel Hedgeman was one. The AKA founders were 15 of 30 women at Howard in 1905, 06, 07, 08. Can you imagine how small of a community? So you've got a patriarchal environment, a patriarchal culture where even the female students didn't seem to find their place or fit in, similar to what the Black male students had experienced in other places. And so in an effort to want to band together and create support and to socialize and to be close knit and to have emotional and spiritual, psychological and social support for one another, that is then how we see not just the genesis of Alpha at Cornell, but now the Beta chapter at Howard, and of course the Alpha chapter of AKA at Howard. And then the rest, as they say, is history. 4 other organizations all ended up being founded and established at Howard. Omega Psi Phi, first Black fraternity established at an HBCU. And so it literally just caught wildfire from there. It became a way that Black students said, wow, this is a little bit better than what we were doing, because we were just singing in the choir and going to the debate club and reading books before. Now this is a little bit better. We're developing more confidence. We're being able to serve one another. We're being able to serve our campus. We're being able to socialize and grow a little bit more. See, these students came from communities and environments where their families, their principals of their schools, their teachers, their church members were all engaged in clubs. Everybody thinks Black organizations started with the D9. Absolutely not. These were students who were privileged enough to go to college during a time that just one generation removed from slavery, Black folks weren't going to college. So their fathers and their uncles were Masons, right? Their mothers were involved in club movements at church, in their communities, in knitting clubs, in social clubs, in the National Council of Negro Women. Like, there were lots of organizations that these students came out of. So they saw their parents and community and church members engaged in club organizations. So they just weren't wholly inspired by what the white groups were doing. Was that a source of inspiration? Absolutely. Absolutely. But these were also privileged students at that time because everybody wasn't able to go to college. So there are a lot of different forces at play when we talk about the genesis of these two groups and then the subsequent founding of all the other groups all the way up through the 60s with Iota Phi Theta. So it's so much, Mike. It's so much.
I love that story. That story is just absolutely incredible. And, you know, the last thing I wanted to talk to you about, HBCUs were now the epicenter for cultural performative presentations. So we're talking about yard shows, step shows, colors, chants, song circles. I mean, for somebody like me who went to a flagship institution, not an HBCU, you know, I really didn't get exposure to these things until I was an alumnus, already graduated. So how do we properly showcase the Divine Nine history, culture, creativity to the masses who might not be familiar with other councils outside of these predominantly white fraternities and white sororities?
Are you asking how do we showcase that at PWIs? Or are you asking how we showcase that to the world? Or
I mean, certainly, I think we start probably at PWIs and then kind of grow it from there, because I think, you know, as the PWI institution, when they see this, like you go to an AFLV Central, this is like the biggest show there is. I mean, and it brings everybody together. It's so great. It gives you so much energy and so much excitement around fraternity and sorority like nothing else. Nothing. I haven't seen anything else like it. So how do we showcase that?
So what is, oh my gosh, how do I answer that question? Just showcase it. You know, I mean, give Black filmmakers, give Black documentary producers money so they can showcase it. What we are knowing now as mainstream, or what the status quo is now seeing, has been so for decades in our community, right? I remember when the Cosby Show came on television, you saw a Black doctor married to a Black attorney who had 5 Black children growing up in Brooklyn in a big, beautiful brownstone, going to college, having culture, having family dinner parties, grandma and grandpa coming over. Oh my gosh, you mean there's Black families who are doing well like that, and they're affluent and they're educated? We've been knowing that. Y'all just now getting that.
Just now learning.
We've been, that's my uncle and my aunt. When I go over my grandparent, we've been doing that, all right? It just got introduced to the masses, to the mainstream. In the same way, so did Black fraternalism. Even now, at its most highest point, right? If you have the ultimate knockdown, drag out yard show, yard fest, step show at a PWI, I'm not going to say it pales in comparison to HBCUs, but it does, you know, because a lot of these groups were established in the 70s. In the 80s, I met this weekend some young ladies at Northern Alabama University, where their AK chapter, our sorority, was established. Their chapter was started in 1980 or 81. Like, that's crazy, when, you know, a lot of these HBCU chapters were started, you know, 75 years ago, 80 years ago, 90 years ago. And so I'm not saying that you have to try to catch up. I'm not saying that yours is not as good. I'm just saying it's a different experience. So how do we showcase it? We, first of all, let it be ours. It is ours. Let it be ours. Don't try to be taking it. I would say that. I don't know. I want you to be great with what you do, how you do it. Kill it. Pick up and kill it and kill it and kill it. Do your thing. Let ours be ours. But then what we do is you give us the opportunity to talk about the history and the influence of a military culture, of the African gumboot miners who would wear boots and couldn't communicate. Give us opportunities to introduce not only the history to ourselves, because many of us don't know the deep-seated history of how that performative culture started, and the elements of the call and response, and the influence of the Black church, of African historical aspects, of the military, because at a time in the country when Black military students were drafted into the war and then returned as veterans and joined, they brought those cadences with them. My left, right. They brought those call and response. So the Black church, the singing, the rounds, all of these influences all worked in tandem to create this amazing, I want to call it a phenomenon, Mike, right? The phenomena of the Black fraternal movement. So we showcase it by creating edutainment, right? Educational and learning experiences, so that we, as well as the masses, can get a comprehensive learning, because it is fantastic. The costumes, the songs, the energy, it's fantastic, right? It's something you've never seen before. And if the mind can conceive it, somebody's imagination is going to bring it to fruition, right? And so that's how even now, if you looked on the internet and you saw pictures and these probates and these coming out shows and the campus presentations, they're just fantastical. And so you showcase it by showcasing it. Give people money. Give Spike Lee put School Days out in 1989 on a shoestring budget. He shot that right down here at Morehouse Hampton at the AU Center, at Morehouse, Spelman, Clark Atlanta, and Morris Brown campuses on a shoestring budget. But that finally put HBCU culture and the Black fraternal movement up on the silver screen. So give Black directors money so that these stories can be told. And while there's rituals, right? While there's discretion, we can't let everything be known, but you can, of course, see and understand why it's such a spiritual experience, right? It is I have cried before singing our hymn. I have cried before when, we get around our tree and we sing our chapter song. And so it's a spiritual experience as well. So, Mike, it's just so much. It's just
I love it. All right. So for everyone who's listening right now, I know they're, hearing all of this excitement in your voice and all of your expertise and knowledge. And they're thinking, how do we get all this information to our students on our campus from Ms. Tish Norman? So if students want to bring you to their campus to educate about the Black fraternal movement, where is the best place for them to go and to connect with you?
Right here. First of all, you mentioned, I don't know if my book is backwards. Is it backwards to you?
No, it's right on. You're good.
It's right on. This book right here, everybody. Can I just point a personal privilege, Mike? Can I toot our own horn?
Of course.
We are the first speakers agency not to release one, but 2 comprehensive books. And this one, I turned it sideways because this one is significantly thicker than our first book, right? Because I think it just contains that much more fruitful information. Look me up on Greek University's website, everybody. This book right here starts off, right? The first chapter really examines and unpacks through a snapshot. I couldn't go too deep into it, or else it'd be the whole book, right? of the history of fraternalism in this country. So starting with IFC, Panhellenic, NPHC, multicultural, all MGC, all of the other and subsequent fraternal and sororal organizations are discussed at what we would call a foundation level in that book. Find me on Greek University. That's greekuniversity.org/Tish. Hit me up on all social medias at Speaker Tish Norman on IG, Speaker Tish Norman on Facebook, as well as my website, tishnorman.com, because in case you can't tell, I love talking about this subject. I have spent many years researching this stuff, and it's something that I can talk to audiences with ad nauseum. It's not just for Black people. It's not just for affiliated members. It is for all councils, all colors, all people, all students. Get to know this history, because this history is part of American history. And so give us the opportunity and we'll come and train and teach your organizations and your councils, and we'll have a whole bunch of fun while we do it.
I love it. This episode was straight fire. So thank you, Tish, for bringing the energy to us this morning. To all of our listeners, thank you so much for listening. We hope you like it. We hope you share it with other fraternity and sorority leaders on campus. And we'll see you on another episode of the Fraternity Foodie Podcast. Thanks so much. Bye for now.